Welcome, everyone. My name is Terry Hildebrandt. I'm the Director of Evidence-Based Coaching at the Fielding Graduate University. And today we have an exciting panel of guests that are going to be talking about professional coaching with military leaders and veterans. And this is part of our Evidence-Based Coaching Professional Series Webinars, where we talk about how coaching really applies to many industries and all professions. We believe that coaching is a core skill for all leaders moving forward in this world of fast-paced collaboration. So it's important for everyone to be able to do that. I think we have a dog in the background. I'm not sure, Ellen, I think I'm going to mute you. Okay, I think we found out who that was. Okay, so today we're going to be joined by three prominent panelists, and I'm going to briefly mention their names, and then they will say more about their work with veterans and military leaders. So today we have Joe Lara. He is the Director of Programs at the Honor Foundation, and he does some great work with individuals who are transitioning from military service to private life. So he'll be talking about how coaching is an integral part of what they're doing there with the Honor Foundation. We have Barton Bushner, and he is an alum of Fielding from our PhD program. He's also an adjunct professor of military psychology at the Adler School of Psychology. So we're really excited to have Barton here. And we have Raquel Costin. She's also an alum of the evidence-based coaching program at Fielding and works as an internal coach at the Department of Defense. So we're thrilled to have Raquel here to talk about what it's like to be an internal coach full-time or working in the federal government. So thank you all for being here. We're excited to have you. And I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with a series of questions, and then we'll allow the audience to ask questions later. So if you have any questions, you can please type those into the group chat as they come up, and then I'll invite you to come on live and share your question later. So as a way of introduction, panelists, please tell us about your journey of incorporating coaching into your work with military leaders and or veterans. So let's start actually with Joe. So Joe, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about your work.
Great, thank you, Terry, and thank you, panelists and guests. It's an honor to work with you for this hour. So my background, I'm a 24-year veteran myself, served in the military, a code breaker for the NSA. The last 10 years, I was working alongside the SEAL teams. So it was a really unique skill set. I had to physically keep up with them. So the work was very challenging, demanding, but learned a great ton about myself and the team. So in transition, I actually was a fellow of the Honor Foundation, which is a nonprofit designed to help special operations personnel transition into civilian life. And what I was not expecting was to be challenged and pushed and pulled the way coaches can kind of create those environments. And I actually had a transformation is what really how I would describe it. So it wasn't just my personal life, but it was also my professional life was impacting my personal life as well. And flash forward to today, now I'm actually running the programs and curriculum across several campuses. We've served 607 special operators thus far. We have much more work to do, and coaching is absolutely integral to everything we do, because there's only so much we can have as far as classroom discussion. Maybe 10% is absorbed. It's that extra perspective and special attention that the coach can provide with that veteran, and another ear and lens to provide, which is absolutely incredible and a critical piece to what we do.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Joe. So Bart, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about your work in the academic space.
Well, thank you, Terry. I appreciate being here. And as Miguel knows, since Miguel's on the call, my dissertation at Fielding was based on mentoring of transitioning veterans. And that was based on a hypothesis that a lot of the transition issues that veterans are having are basically lack of a mentor that helps them to navigate this space of being in the military, which is a very specific type of environment, and into the next phases of their life. And those are, it's a much more open-ended equation there. So the question is then, how do mentors engage in that process, and how are they influenced? And Joe, I appreciate you mentioning your work with the NSA. As one of my students at Adler University is really a great example of that process, and how we coach and mentor people through the transition process in a transformative way. Her name was Shannon Kent, graduated with a master's in psychology from Adler and had been accepted to Uniformed Services University. And unfortunately, because of some glitches in the Department of Navy and the Pentagon, she ended up, instead of going to USU, she ended up getting sent to Syria, where she had already deployed 5 times. So she was an Arab linguist and did a lot of translation for special forces, and was in fact doing that kind of translational work when she was killed due to a improvised explosive device suicide attack that happened in Syria, along with 2 other Americans. So this is some serious business, but Shannon really exemplified a lot of the coaching, I think the credible coaching that helps to engage military folks when they're in a transition process. And part of it is just being aware of what the experience is, how intense it can be, and modeling the way forward that other possibilities exist on the other side of that, where you don't lose an identity, but you actually integrate it into some other things. So that's kind of where I wanted to frame it.
Great, thank you, Barton. Raquel, if you would mind saying a bit about your work.
Sure. So my name is Raquel Costin. It's nice to be among my colleagues. I'm actually internal to NSA, so we have a common theme here. And thank you for mentioning Shannon. It's a terrible loss. So, so that's my path. I've been working internally for about 16 years. I've done primarily workforce development, training, and human resources. And most of the time, since we work in a joint environment, I have had the honor to become an internal coach and also do some career development with our military. So when working with leaders, it's often helping them. So a lot of times we have civilian and military leaders working together with a blended workforce. And so you can imagine the different cultures sort of collide. And so I spent a lot of time working with leaders on how to sort of manage and lead a joint workforce, how our cultures are very different. And sort of what are the techniques that, what does that look like to be managing at the agency with civilian people? And then the other part of my work is helping some of our military people transition for their second career. So it's sort of like making the translation between all their skill sets that they have, done in the military, and how to make that look, what does that look like on a resume when they go out into the civilian world, and how do they make those skills translatable? So it's been a real honor to be able to do that work.
Great, thank you, Raquel. Our next question is, how is coaching military leaders different than coaching civilian leaders and executives? And who would like to start? I was thinking Raquel might have some insight into this.
I can start, because we experience it every day. I lost my supervisor. I have one civilian and one military supervisor. I think the biggest surprise, and others can, especially former military, the biggest surprise that they often find is that a civilian workforce is not as structured. So a lot of the influence and getting people to work and do it's through informal influence rather than formal hierarchy and structures. And that has been quite a big surprise for some of our military leaders. And we've worked on the coaching piece of this. What happens when you can't just do command and control leadership, where you're actually doing informal influence? There's maybe different motivators. Our structures are completely different. And how do you continue to be effective in that environment? So I think that's one of the surprises, is the structured piece. And the other is sort of maybe the bittersweet piece of pursuing a second career. I think sometimes people are really excited, but then when they realize, all of the choices that they're going to have to make about their new life, it can become really overwhelming sometimes.
Makes sense. Bart, what do you think about this subject?
Well, the whole idea of a military-civilian gap is an interesting one that's been studied quite a lot. This year, I got a chance to go to the Inter-University Seminar on Military-Civilian Relations, where they're exploring that from a sociological perspective. But the interesting thing is, I guess that when you look at military, folks that are looking at making a transition onto the civilian side. Civilians don't use the word civilian. So one is that's kind of not really a thing. It's kind of very open-ended. So what are we moving towards? Well, that becomes a question that has to be answered. So they really need to have some answers into what kind of context they're going into. So some work that I've done with the Air Force and the Marine Corps, Lauren McKenzie and Susan Steen with the Air War College and the Cultural Institute, is actually working on developing intercultural competence among military members so that they have an easier time not only working in the foreign spaces where we send them to work and understanding those cultures and finding ways to prevent unfortunate misunderstandings that can be deadly in those environments, but then also to leverage those skills, coming back with their own families, for example, or in their own communities. And I think somebody mentioned reservists as a particular case. Reservists are, and I spent half of my time in the military, which was 30 years in the reserve, and half of the time on active duty. And there very definitely is a difference in the skill sets and intercultural capacities between active duty and reservists, as reservists have to make that transition back and forth constantly, whereas the active duty, sometimes they need a little extra coaching to make those cultural adaptations.
I think that's a really important piece. Joe, what's been your experience? I know you've focused mostly on military leaders and veterans, but I'm curious what your perspective would be on that versus civilians.
Well, it's interesting. So the coaching actually occurs from the civilians with no military background, and they make some of the best coaches. And one particular coach, he looked into the military ethos, specifically the SEAL ethos, and it's sort of something that they repeat daily almost, just to hold themselves accountable. And in that ethos, he uses that to encourage other coaches who actually work with executives day in and day out to realize the differences. And so the ethos, there's some similarities where it starts out something to the effect of, looking to train, to fight, and to win, very much like an executive, demanding discipline, very much like an executive. But as he starts walking through the ethos, there's a little bit of separation. And he brings this out. I didn't bring this out. And it's basically, at any given point, I need to lead, but I also may need to follow. And that's where the separation kind of begins, because executives sometimes don't see themselves as followers. They're there to lead. And the further that this coach walks the rest of the coaches through this process, you start seeing this piece of servant leadership and humility that's woven in the military. It's just kind of part of the culture. And that may not be present with all executives. There are some that do amazingly well and actually implement that type of behavior in their organizations. But it's really interesting to hear this consistent theme, not just from this coach who pointed it out, but from a majority of our coaches that work with very senior people, large organizations, of just the mindset. So there's very similar in certain behaviors, but then there's a certain separation that occurs when you're looking at really taking care of the person to your left and right.
Good point. Thank you. Third question. How have you seen coaching support the effectiveness of military leaders? Anyone like to kick us off?
I can jump in, I guess, from my side internally. I think I'm thinking of a particular person that I worked with for a long time. I mean, he had come back from being overseas for a really long time, and it was very difficult for him to make the transition back. Again, we're working for a pretty big bureaucratic organization, and he was used to being in a very, getting things done very, very quickly, being able to sort of get people under him to be able to move and lead. And I think being in the field, you have to react quickly. There's not a lot of time for you to think and mull over some of these decisions. And so it was working through sort of the pause principle and being able to allow him to stop that trigger reaction, to slow down. And we actually, and at first I was like, is he going to really go for this? To start to think about meditation and mindfulness and some of the things that would sort of calm his reaction. And it took, at first when we sort of introduced the idea, he was a little skeptical, but as time went on and he started to integrate a little bit more of the sort of the mindfulness, the meditation, the slowing down, he was finding himself to be more effective in dealing with some of the bureaucracies and the workforce that he had to deal with.
Great case study. Thank you, Raquel, for sharing that. Joe, Bart, thoughts?
Well, we mostly deal with folks in transition, but most of our fellows, as we refer them, as still have about a year, sometimes 2 years left in their service. And so, and they range from very senior, 06 captain in the Navy, down to very junior E5, maybe been in the military for 6 years or so. And the spectrum is there. But the leaders really gravitate towards a lot of the work we do in the early phase of our program, where we dive into their strengths and talents and actually understand, and they can define values, not the ones that are on a wall that are aspirational, but the ones that they actually live out. And you can kind of see this, they're looking at themselves, but it's almost like from a different lens, again, the coach and all the different pieces coming in and converging. And they get this sense of growth, and they can't wait to take that back to their work. That's the cool part that we see. And sometimes they're asking us to actually provide some of that training for their teams that are in the middle of their workup. They're about to deploy, but they would like to at least offer the opportunity for their leaders within the teams to understand it and take part of that, because that self-discovery piece can actually put you at another level, and it just make you more aware and more cognizant of the value you bring. Yeah, so it's pretty remarkable.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe.
I would add to that, the work we do at Adler is at the master's level, and we have both military service members who are in service, as well as veterans and family members, and then some clinicians that don't have military experience. So this idea of, one, and I appreciate the mindfulness connection, because it's something that, and slowing things down and being more analytical and applying theory, rather than applying, okay, your learning is basically, you learn one, do one, teach one. In this case, where our learning happens more in a reflective environment, where people are sharing stories and then looking at what the meaning is in those stories, and then also looking at how others perceive that. And so being able to expand that level of perception of how things are viewed from first, second, and third person perspectives is a big area of opening that a lot of our folks experience, and they cross some boundaries that they maybe don't even realize are there in the beginning.
Good point. Excellent. So how have you seen coaching support veterans make the transition from military service to civilian life and work? And since this is primarily Joe's mission, I'm going to ask him to start for us today.
Sorry, it's unmuting. Yeah, the coaching piece for veteran transition. Like I said, we have this 3-month program. The first phase is really broken up in 3 phases. The first phase is really self-reflection. It's very much the same words that the other panelists are using. Pausing, taking time to think and self-reflect. And I love the fact that Barton said stories. That's what we do inside the Honor Foundation, is tell a lot of stories. And in that, the fellows start getting a sense of clarity of who they are. And that's the first phase. The second phase, they move into this place where they can actually start using that new language and build a new lexicon to describe their value. As Raquel was saying, the translation is super difficult. That's what every veteran has struggles with, and hiring managers equally have the struggle of taking that job and translating it. Well, in that self-discovery, they're pulling this language forward, and they're not using military terms now. They're using terms that we use in daily life, but it's new to them. but it's resonant to the 99% that didn't volunteer. They're like, yep, we got it. We understand that. I can use that in my company. I can use that in my organization. And they're learning how to weave that into their 30-second elevator pitch or their resume. And it actually makes sense. It's real. It's authentic because it's based on stories that they know. And then the final phase is really inspirational, and that's where we'll talk about entrepreneurship. We'll take them to company visits and expose them to different cultures. And every step of the way, the coach is there. That coach is, again, that other set of eyes. And so if the fellow's sort of stuck in that phase one, the coach can help them navigate that, ask a lot of questions. Probably more questions are asked in that first phase. And in the second phase, there's a little bit more direction and mentoring, actually holding them accountable. Make sure you follow up with a thank you for that interview and all those steps that the veteran needs. So again, I'll have a cohort of about 35 fellows, but each fellow has a coach, one coach that's working with them the entire time, and it's worked beautifully.
Great, excellent. Thanks, Joe.
To echo off of that, I like that you kind of did that in sort of the phases, because that's a lot of times what we would do too, is sort of identify sort of what are the values, transferable skills, maybe even have them take an inventory to say, okay, let's stop, you did all of this in your first career, but there's so many things that are going to translate into the regular world, and getting them to use the vocabulary so that they can put it onto a resume that looks, that can actually go to a human resource executive, or if they want to go into business. And that's one of the things, like, I think is first is this awareness, because for many military members, their whole life has been planned out. They didn't have as many choices. And all of a sudden it's sort of like this, oh my goodness, really? Like, I get to choose? I'm like, yeah, you actually get to choose. I was like, and so once they kind of discover some of these options, then really helping them to narrow it down to say, okay, what do you need? What information do you need? What action steps do you need to take? And then it's holding them accountable, like you're saying, to kind of piece through that. So what do these job seeking things look like? So yeah, it's inspiring.
Excellent. Thank you, Raquel.
And in the program that we have at Adler, the focus there is in military psychology. So that does kind of shape some of the goals of the people that are in the program in the first place. But we do find out some of the active duty folks and some of the veterans are actually there to explore some things that they're trying to work out themselves. So we do mentoring like we do at fielding. It's in a cohort driven, but it's also the faculty mentor type of model. And one of the theories that seems to resonate very strongly with those folks is the transformational learning theory, which is not necessarily a part of the clinical psychology world. We're not Adlerian psychology, if you're not familiar with it, is more social systems anyway. So we try to keep people out of that space, and most veterans don't want to be in that space anyway. But we do look at some difficult experiences, not necessarily as pathology, but as opportunities for learning. Like if you look at Mesereau's work, he looks at disorienting dilemmas as very often kind of the space where people make big turns in their lives by trying to make meaning of something that otherwise doesn't line up with the world that they've been experiencing. So that kind of reflective space, I think, has been very helpful for a lot of our students who come into the program with something that they want to work through.
Great, thank you. Excellent. So to build on what you were just saying, Barton, what unique issues can come up when coaching veterans?
I don't mind starting with this one.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Yeah, and so Barton, I was looking at your last blog, and there was so many good nuggets in that, but specifically this line, and I have printed here. So while many veterans do struggle with modulating their responses to environmental stimuli after coming home, being sensitive or seeing the world differently does not necessarily rise to the level of pathology. Exactly what you just said before I read. And that's me. So my personal story, and this is going to probably sound not great, after coming home, after experiencing that environment that's in Iraq, Afghanistan, and seeing loss and experiencing that, coming back to the world, I felt a huge disconnection, and just plain and simple, I didn't like being around people. what I heard in my mind sounded like first world problems, complaining, and granted, internally, I was being extremely judgmental, but I didn't realize that. I just wanted to close myself off from the noise and just find my own tribe and stick with what was safe. But coming through this process of being coached, there was one particular coach that helped me out, and he said, "Joe, I think you actually do like people, and here's why." And so in my stories, what he heard was that I took care of my teammates. What he heard is that I had the patience to take care of them. What he heard is that I have, the patience to develop them. And so he started helping me slowly peel back those layers of discomfort and own the fact that I do care for people. I just need to rethink things. And so over a period of time, I became more curious about people. I learned how to ask good questions about people to the point where now I love being around people. I think that term PTSD and there's a big stigma, and it gets thrown around a lot. But when you wrote that sentence and just hearing you speak, it just makes so much sense that it's not as grave. It's just something that you have to deal with, and you can work through it. And a lot of our veterans, I share that story to my cohort, and every single head nods up and down in agreement. It's almost like we've all experienced the same thing.
I was going to say, there's definitely a level of vulnerability. You always have to have that within your coaching practice, but I do feel like you may, it does take a little bit more time sometimes to develop. When you've had such a, different world experience, to build that vulnerability and to let that sort of go and show your real self. It is a bit of a dance. I found with the coaching relationship, especially, sometimes with all clients, but definitely with veterans or people who've returned back from the field.
The way our coaches succeed in that is usually demonstrating vulnerability first, by modeling it, and yes, the experiences will be different, but just it's authentic, it's real, and that's a way to invite the veteran to open up themselves.
One of the things that we found very helpful is doing exercises with phenomenological writing, which sounds, kind of technical, but once I think we explain what it is, a phenomenological writing exercise is basically looking at what is an episode of lived experience that you've had, and then looking at it from a variety of different lenses. So again, not to get into the too much of the weeds on that for our purposes of the call here today. We look at Husserl's view of phenomenology as looking at what are the essential things themselves, not our programmed responses to them. How do we get deeper into that? How do we get into the embodied experience of it? How do we get into the contextual analysis of what else was going on when this happened? So very often, and I would say I've used this in veterans retreats formats more so than in the classroom, although we do have phenomenological writing modules in all of our classes. In the retreat format, the veterans are kind of given the freedom to write about things, not necessarily in stories, but use poetry to describe things in oblique terms, and also to deeply reflect on things in the company of each other. And what we've heard from them is that there just are not that many spaces where you can do that with a group of people. So creating a space, even if it's one-on-one with a coach, that's great. If it's with a small group, that's great. But the important thing is just having that openness and Raquel, as you mentioned, that trust relationship, be able to be the primary determinant of what goes on.
Okay. Terry, if I could add, in the curriculum, and we learned this over time, the science backs up that writing is actually helpful, not typing, not just talking, but actually pen to paper. There's science to back that up. And so across the 3 months, we encourage journaling. So we've created a workbook which guides them. It's guided because if it's just blank pages, it's not going to get filled out. So there's actual prompts, and we start very simple. It's basically things you can change about your life and things you can't change, and the prompts will be, where you grew up, you can't change that, right? Your ethnicity, you can't change that. On the other page of, your friends and peers, you can change that eventually. Your neighborhood, you can change that. And so we start slowly, but then the questions start getting a little bit more heavier. And I don't need to go into how heavy they get. You can obviously imagine. But the thought process is this, is that if we ask them a simple question, and I do this on day one, what are your concerns about transition? That's just a simple question. And the first thing that comes out is that surface layer answer. Well, finding the right opportunity, the right salary, the right means for my life. And then, and so you can kind of put them in that first category of external needs and concerns. And then eventually, if I just give them pause and they start, I'll say, what else and what else? Eventually they'll start saying, well, I'm having a sense of loss of identity, sense of loss of tribe. Okay, now we're getting real. This is the internal concerns and needs. And then there's that other deeper bucket, probably on the philosophical side. Am I good enough? And will I be accepted? Again, we're working with Navy SEALs in the special operations community, and they're wondering if they're good enough. And it's just fascinating to be in this environment. But also create the environment where they feel they can explore and be safe about it. So, yeah, they're encouraged to journal, and those things come out. They do pop on the paper, and then we encourage them to talk about it with one another and just cause that discussion. And they start realizing, I'm not in this alone. We're all feeling the same way.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Powerful examples.
And I think what you said about that huge transition, it almost reminds, it's like this, it's a huge transition. You're going from really closing one part of your life to going into a whole unknown. So I can't stress that enough, that helping someone through that transition is so important.
So I have one last prepared question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So audience, if you have any questions, feel free to start typing those into the group chat, and or we'll allow you to unmute and ask your question live if you prefer. But the last question is, how can professional coaches get involved in volunteer work with veterans?
One practical group, I guess, and I'm not sure how many coaches get involved with this, but it's the Give an Hour Foundation. It's mostly clinical counseling, but they provide pro bono counseling work for veterans, and they've been very effective at doing that. And then some of the I know one of the groups I work with in terms of helping out with the job, the vocational transition. The Student Veterans of America has chapters at every university. So if you go on a campus and you're near where you're living and you want to go ahead and get involved in helping student veterans, they always need some advisors and mentors there. So I would look them up. And then every state has a chapter of the National Committee for Employer Support of Guard and Reserve. Some of those chapters are very active, some are less so, but these are all volunteers essentially organized by state that help National Guard and Reserve members in particular with their service obligations and to manage the relationship with employers. And that can use some coaching assistance. We have an ombudsman program, for example, that mediates when it's necessary. But also these groups very often get involved in some of the job search, and that's where there's an opportunity to really help people sort things out, because there really isn't a lot in the space of where you separate and then where you go on into either higher education or directly into the job market.
Great, thank you, Bart. And Joe, I know your organization does look for volunteers. Would you like to share a little bit about your program and how people might get involved?
So as I mentioned, we try to match and pair up a coach with a fellow for the entire 3-month experience. And the coach's tribe, as we refer to them, are very diverse. Their backgrounds, there's a few clinical psychologists, but most of them are professionals, executives. They're doing executive coaching. They're certified coaches. Some are not certified at all, and they're simply serving in an executive capacity in their business. Others are entrepreneurial. some deal with life coaching. And so basically what we do is we have an intake of fellows. We'll have an application, and we'll see what the fellow possibly may need, and we'll try to match that up with the sort of the skill set of that coach. It's not a perfect match. At the end of the day, we hope that it works, and most of the time it does. Very rarely will there not be a good match, but if that occurs, we encourage both parties just to let us know, and we'll find you another coach. The coaches are very professional, obviously, and they always say, "Hey, we're here to serve." And so with that said, some coaches are really good with the resume writing and don't want to deal with the really difficult type of questions to help somebody push through the mental boundaries that person's going through. And so because of that, we encourage the coaches to really talk with one another and even inform the staff, hey, what do you need help with? So you're not coaching alone or in a bubble. We also encourage you to actually understand the content of the classes. So your sessions with your fellow are actually, they make sense for that fellow who's going through the program. You're not saying something that's counterintuitive. And we've actually made a request for coaches from fielding, and there's been a really good response. In fact, some of them have already been onboarded, and I believe they're going to start working with some of our fellows this spring. So excited for that. The future, we will absolutely need more coaches. There's about 170 in our network right now, but not all 170 are currently working. So there's about 90 across all our campuses that are working. So San Diego, Virginia Beach, Carolina, and this virtual cohort. There's Green Beret and Navy SEALs working in all parts of the world. And so through technology, they can meet on a platform like this and receive the content and still be coached. So we're there to serve a large group of people, and it's going to require a lot of resources, and the coaches can absolutely help us out.
Great, thank you, Laura. Raquel, any thoughts on this question?
No, Joe, I'd love to talk to you more about what you're doing, and that's great, because it'd be something I'd love to help out with. I probably could talk more about full-time employment. So if those of you who are interested in that, we have a lengthy process. Always willing, if anybody has any questions or wants to refer someone to us.
Yeah, I think this is worthwhile saying. If someone is interested in becoming a coach in the military, like you are, what recommendation would you have for someone?
So we tend to, it's interesting, our internal coaching, we have about maybe 3 full-time, that's all they do, coaches who came in with psychology, PhD psychologies. Then there's a cadre of cohorts that come from places like, well, they could have come from anywhere, but like I have a training, workforce development, HR background and a coaching certification. And so there's about, I don't know, a cohort of people that do this internal adjunct coaching as well as their job. So that's kind of, so you can come in, I know we hired recently for career counselors. So that may be another aspect of human resource professionals.
Great, excellent. Yeah, I also coach in the VA personally,
Mm-hmm.
and on their roster of coaches, and work a lot with SES leaders and really enjoy that work. And so there are opportunities throughout for external coaches as well, like myself. Great. So I see we have a couple of questions that are coming up in the chat room. The first is from Kimberly. Kimberly, would you like to ask your question, or would you prefer that we read it? If you'd like to ask it, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and come online.
There we go. I was trying. Hello, and thank you so much for being here. This is such a, as I said, an important topic. I find it really interesting. I do coach people with trauma, so I'm really interested in how you coach veterans. And I'm very interested, Joe, that you said that most of your coaches aren't veterans. So I was really surprised to hear that. And I'm wondering, do you find resistance when your coaches, when the veterans first come in for coaching, any of you? I mean, is it because they're in such a, I don't want to say a denial process when they're overseas or when they're in action, they can't really address any of that. So when they come to you and they have to kind of go through this coaching, do you have to break them down first? Or do you know, I mean, I know you're not having therapy, but Joe, you said that they go through a book and they're looking at positives and negatives, and they're, looking at options, and they're really having to dissect some things. And is it hard to have them be introspective at that point?
Yeah, every person's different. And so I think it's really important to kind of realize, like, even the stereotype of that, all veterans, they're just robots, they follow orders. I think that's also a negative stereotype. The reality is they're all coming at different paces, at different places in their life. We've had fellows that come through and something will trigger tears and they break down. But the fact that they break down is something that you normally don't see inside the military. So that tells us they feel safe, right? They can do that. That's something that we don't do. And if you think about it, if you have children, if you played sports or you have children that play sports, they always want to be in the game, and they never, even if they twist their ankle or whatever, they're like, no, I'm fine. Let me keep going. It's the same mentality almost for the military veteran that's in combat. You don't want to stay on the sideline. You want to be in the fight because you're going to let your brothers and sisters down. That's kind of the mentality, especially with the folks that we work with at this high elite level. They work so hard to get there, and they're just wired that way, and they would die for one another. And so because of that, that's just an example of hiding a physical injury. But think about all the mental and emotional stuff that they're probably suppressing, whether it be a divorce, whether that be a birth of a child, but they can't be there because they have to be somewhere else. There's all these things that are occurring in their life, and they're just suppressing it. Why? Because they don't want to let their brothers and sisters down. And now we're going to come to this point of transition where for the first time, they don't answer to the government for the first time. And yes, there's a lot of family-oriented people in our room, and they'll say that my family's first. But at the end of the day, if the military says go, you go. And right now, when they come to us, they have to realize that I get to choose what I do. I get to decide what I wear, which is so. I mean, all those little things that we take for granted are occurring in there, and it's hitting them really fast. Some fellows absorb it, and they actually crave it, and they enjoy it, and they proceed, and they do extremely well. Some have a hard time. So the coaches are constantly challenged. Some of our most experienced coaches will be the first ones to say, if you coached, every time you coach a fellow, it's a new experience. It's not the same. It doesn't matter how old they are, how young they are, their experience, they're just so different.
I've coached several lifers, 30 years that have 35 years, and it's almost like that then. You would liken it to that in a way, that same mentality of being
and also
of being regimented into a certain way of life, and now having to transition out into something completely different.
And I think about this too. This is something that we discovered, and it's just so simple. I have two teenagers, 16 and 18, and right now they're trying to figure out what they want to be in life, right? That's the question we all ask. What do I want to do? What do I want to study? I did the same thing. But when you join the military at 18, that's answered for you. Your culture, your team, your tribe, your language, you're given that. Flash forward, now we have a 30-year Navy SEAL. They've been around the world. They probably carried the nuclear codes for the president at one point. Like, they've done incredible things. And they might as well be 18 years old again because they're trying to figure out, oh my gosh, what am I going to be? What do I do? It's almost like a time machine. And so you can imagine that the emotions just crashing in on you after 30 years.
Well, really, really great questions. So we have another question coming in from Rob. Rob, would you like to come online and join the conversation?
Yes. Hi. So I taught social workers for a number of years here in northern New Mexico. And we had a remarkable number of veterans who wanted to be social workers. In fact, I have to say that they're some of the finest social workers I've ever known, because they know how difficult it is to get services. And they're going to make sure that doesn't happen to anybody they work with. They're dedicated. And my example is, I was teaching research methods, and I wanted to talk about a confounding or challenging construct. And I picked vicarious trauma, and I innocently talked about what it was. It was like witnessing someone else die on the battlefield. And in the back of the room, a veteran just dissociated, gone, completely gone. It totally startled the class. They had not witnessed that before. I have. And what I did is, because I was teaching, is I just moved the class on. And after a while, he came back, and I checked in with him at break. And so my question is, does it ever happen to you that when you're talking about another seemingly innocent topic, all of a sudden a veteran just completely loses it? How do you handle that? I mean, you're not prepared for it, right? Generally, I mean, I don't know how to be prepared for dissociation. It just happens. So that's my question.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I will maybe, Barton, I'm sure you have probably have maybe a clinical experience. I have had this happen occasionally while coaching or teaching. And I think your response was probably a good one. I mean, if the person was just not violent, then, you know, it's really to just kind of move forward and then check in. That's sort of how we've handled it in the workplace. But again, it's that safe place and not, you know, and just really making sure that they're getting their needs met.
Yeah, this is that's a very good point. Is that there's sometimes that not you know, one of the things that we are kind of trained to do some in the coaching field or in the academic field is that we want to solve people's problems. And if you run into that kind of context where something is coming up that's coming in from another context, but something in this environment's triggering it, one of the things that we try to encourage our facilitators to do at retreats is just to completely get everybody, not just the facilitators, but everybody in the group out of the problem-solving mode. Let's not jump into that problem. Let's just focus on the relationship, the relationality. That creates a more of a bond. You can use a feeling of safe, being safe, or however you want to characterize it. But it shifts the attention from whatever's triggering to the relationality in the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, we also have another question from Patricia. Would you like to ask, or I can read it for you? Patricia, you're unmuted.
Oh, I was going to say you could read it. That's fine. Yeah, I just was curious, and maybe you mentioned a little about this before, but just wanted to ask again about if you're not someone who has served in the military, how do military people respond to you as a coach? I mean, it doesn't seem like it would be a fit to me. I'm the daughter of a military person and have lived, you know, the military life as a child, but not as an adult. So just curious as if I would even be somebody who they'd be interested in talking to.
Well, one of the interesting,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things that I found out looking at mentors is that mentors aren't necessarily what are veterans in transition. They're not necessarily looking for somebody else with a veteran experience because they're trying to go someplace else. So pragmatism tells you that you need to go to somebody who's successful in what you want to do and learn from them. So as a result of that, most mentoring happens not just in dyads, but in networks. A veteran in transition very often will create a network around themselves that has various people who are influential. What makes the decision, or what helps make the decision as to whether this is a person I will listen to or I will want to work with, is whether they know what they're talking about or not. Because again, in a military context, if you're with somebody that really doesn't know what they're doing, you can get killed. So that kind of gravitation towards competence. So if you're someone, and also this is something we've observed about women veterans, is that we haven't really formally looked at how women veterans network as opposed to men veterans when they're in transition, and we're starting to discover more about this. But women women veterans tend to discount their status as a veteran, which is not a good thing, not accurate at all. So I would say if you're a family member of a veteran, and that's where we tend to use the term military connected instead of veteran or non-veteran or military. And even in fielding veterans connections, it was loose connections are just great. So if you've been in a family, you're part of the family.
Excellent. So I think we have answered most of the questions. There have been some requests for Joe's information. I have posted that in the chat room if you are interested in potentially working with the Honor Foundation. I also have another organization that is also looking for coaches at the moment called US Vets Las Vegas. And they are looking for coaches for their internal executive leadership team. So I'm going to post their information too if you are interested in working with some military leaders and organizational leaders that might be helpful too. So we have probably time for one more question. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask the panel that they haven't? Okay, I'd like to then thank the panel for all of you coming today. As we have seen in the chat room, this is obviously a really important topic and near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, and we really appreciate all the work that everyone has done on the panel and really honor the work you continue to do to support military leaders and veterans. So again, thank all of you, Joe, Barton, Raquel, for your willingness to spend some time with us this evening. And I'm sure we will continue this dialogue online. So I also want to invite everyone on the call, if you're not yet a member of Fielding's coaching community of practice, you are welcome to join. And it's free of charge and open to anyone who's interested in furthering the cause of coaching in the world. And you can easily join by going to coach.fielding.edu at just coach.fielding.edu and click on Coaching Community of Practice, and you will see a website with all the great opportunities that afford you as a member. And at the very end of the page, you'll see a subscribe button. So we just have a few key questions. And you can reach this directly as well at ccop.fielding.edu. If you want to go directly to this page, it's ccop.fielding.edu. We also have some other exciting webinars coming up. The one next week is on coaching supervision. And we're really excited to have Dr. Damian Goldvarg. He is a former global ICF, International Coach Federation president. Damian is also a personal friend of mine and has a vision of training, coaching, supervision for everyone, and he'll be talking about the 7-eyed model. So if you've never experienced coaching supervision personally, this is an opportunity for you to directly experience the power of it through his demonstration of using what's called the 7-eyed model of coaching supervision. I'm also a professional trained and certified coaching supervisor and have been through Damian's program myself, so I can vouch for this, that it'll be an exciting opportunity to hear from the master himself, who is a friend of Fielding. So come out and enjoy that experience. We also will be having a number of other webinars that you can all participate in, and this particular new year, we're focusing on a number of new topics, particularly dedicated to developing your coaching practice. So keep an eye out for those. And if you miss any of our webinars, you can listen to them later by going to coach.fielding.edu and clicking on Professional Series, which is where this one will be posted, or our Thought Leaders video series, where we share research from many of our PhDs who do research in coaching, like Barton did in his research. So we have probably the largest that we know of research commitment to coaching at Fielding. So you can hear about all of the great research that's going on at Fielding. Our blog posts also give more information, and Barton has a blog that you can go back and read if you would like to learn more by just clicking on read more from today's webinar. We also have on February 12th a Thought Leaders webinar on making the best of it, a new model for understanding and building resilience. So resilience is obviously an important topic for veterans as well. So there's a nice connection there with the research that has been done in this space by Dr. Susan Auger. She's also a Fielding HOD PhD. And then after that, we'll also be talking about tenor, a new approach to coaching clients in emotional intelligence. That'll be led by another Fielding alum, Dr. Jim Knickerbocker, and the co-founder of the Institute for Adaptive Mastery, Charles Jones. So they're talking about new breakthroughs in managing and building emotional intelligence. And then we'll have a panel discussion on coaching women leaders on February 26th. So I have a powerful group of women who are coaches and also leaders themselves who will be coming in and talking about the unique challenges of coaching women. So join us to hear from Joan Flora and Carol Jills Nesland, and then also Melanie Payne-Polk. So keep an eye out for all of our upcoming webinars. There's more to come in the future, and you can read all about them on our EBC blog, which is available at fielding.edu/blog. So again, thank you all for coming tonight, and we hope to see you next week or at one of our following webinars in the near future. And thanks to all of our panel again for their insights and willingness to share their wisdom tonight.
Thank you, Terry, for bringing us all together.
Great, excellent.
And thank you. Nice to meet the other panelists. It was great. Thanks.
Okay.
Likewise, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. It was awesome.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.